Big tech has been particularly brazen on censorship recently. Twitter has even suspended the U.S. Customs and Border Protection Commissioner Mark Morgan for a post touting the success of a border wall between the U.S. and Mexico. Senator Josh Hawley, he joins me now to weigh in not just on big tech, the changes in the federal judiciary, and what's really at stake on the eve of the big election. Thank you for joining us, Senator. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me.
Let's start off with the court, sir. You were a particularly big voice in pushing the change of the conservative legal movement. It kind of culminated in the confirmation of Amy Coney Barrett to the Supreme Court. What kind of victory do you view that in terms of changing the way the conservative legal movement works?
This is a big deal. I mean, Amy Coney Barrett's confirmation is a very big deal. This is the most openly pro-life judicial nominee, Supreme Court nominee of my lifetime. Probably the most openly pro-faith in terms of having quite a lot out there on the record about her faith convictions and not in any way trying to walk back from it. And this is the first time, Sagar, I think in quite a long time, decades, where religious conservatives had a very strong voice in this process. I know for a fact that the White House reached out to religious conservatives. This is even before there was a vacancy. When they were coming up with that second list that they released a couple of months ago, they consulted widely among religious conservatives. Then when there was a vacancy, they consulted again with religious conservatives and really tried to bring them into a fold. This is a big deal because for years, religious conservatives have felt shut out of the process. And with Barrett herself, here you had someone who, again, openly pro-life, who has been openly critical of Roe versus Wade, both in her personal capacity and in her academic writings. And she didn't walk away from any of that. You know, the confirmation hearings, she stuck to her guns. And I think that this is a model of what we can expect, I hope, from Republicans in the future.
Senator, I think some of my more left-wing viewers might not understand that dynamic. Could you explain how religious conservatives felt with Justice Roberts and Justice Gorsuch in the last couple of years?
Well, when you look at this past term, for example, just the last term at the United States Supreme Court, I think what really worries religious conservatives is you still have a court that is very, very activist. And particularly, it's not even so much the results they're reaching, it's how they're treating religious liberty. You know, I mean, in the Bostock opinion, for example, which Justice Gorsuch wrote, religious liberty gets one sentence. I mean, this is a very, very difficult issue, the interplay of religious liberty and Bostock and the sort of rewriting of the 1964 Civil Rights Act. And yet Justice Gorsuch, he just sort of mentions it, all right, and he acknowledges its problems, says, yeah, that's going to create a lot of problems and the court will have to address this issue in the future, so get back to us. I think religious conservatives are horrified at that. They feel under assault in the broader culture, and rightly so. They feel marginalized and made fun of by the mainstream media, which is exactly the truth. And the real truth is, when it comes to the judicial process, Sagar, for years, religious conservatives, have felt seen but not heard, where they're expected to go out and vote. And in fact, the people who really vote on the basis of the court tend to be religious conservatives, conservative Catholics, conservative Jews, evangelical Christians. But they feel like they're not really paid attention to when it comes to getting input for picking judges. And that's why Amy Coney Barrett's a big deal.
Yeah, it's been certainly a change, at least in my lifetime now, to see her on the court. I'd also like to talk to you about tech, just in terms of the developments that we've seen most recently. What's your reaction to Jack Dorsey and Mark Zuckerberg in their most recent hearings? And that thing I lined up earlier about the Customs and Border Patrol, that particularly outraged me. This is one of the nation's largest law enforcement organizations, whose head is locked by Twitter for an overtly political reason. How should the right begin rethinking the way that they approach tech?
I think the first thing is to recognize that these are monopolies, and that these are monopolies that have grown to the power and size that they are because of government, because of the special immunity deal that government has given these companies in Section 230 that has allowed them to avoid suit, to avoid accountability. So they are monopoly-sized companies that are exerting their power to try and control the political process and to try and influence the United States government. And conservatives have got to come to terms with that and realize that these companies are massive, massive threats to the voice and control and power of normal, everyday Americans, and we have to do something about it. Bottom line, Sagar, this behavior by Dorsey and by Zuckerberg et al., Google, is going to go on until Congress does something about it. That's the bottom line.
Right. And so what would you say to people who would say, Senator, I hear you on the censorship, but the answer to speech is not to restrict speech, and that's what something like going after Section 230 would do. In essence, they would say, I hear you on the censorship, but talking about monopolies and government power makes me uncomfortable. What would you say to those people?
Well, the reason, first of all, that these platforms and their behavior are so dangerous is because they are monopolies. I mean, if we had a lot of choices, if there was truly a competitive market, then we could just say, well, get off Facebook and go to the competitor. But here's the deal. There is no competitor to Facebook. There is no legitimate competitor, not even in the ballpark to Facebook. Same deal with Google. Google owns search. They own the delivery of news and information. There's nobody who's anywhere close to their league. So the monopoly question is absolutely central to this. Secondly, just in terms of Section 230, I mean, this is a grant. This is a giveaway that government has given to these companies that has allowed them to become powerful. And in terms of free speech, I mean, the answer is not to restrict speech. The answer is to allow there to be more speech and giving folks, individuals, the ability to sue by changing 230 is not about there being less speech. It's about holding these companies accountable when they censor on the basis of political viewpoints.
And the final thing I'd really like to get with you, sir, is look, we're talking the day before the election. What do you think the stakes are in this election? What do you think, and how do you see which sides would be benefited from either side, Donald Trump's election or Joe Biden's election? How do you see those clearly?
Well, you just look at who is investing in the Biden campaign. I mean, it's Wall Street, it's Silicon Valley. Joe Biden is the candidate of the restoration. You want to go back to liberal globalism. You want to go back to the policies that sent jobs overseas, that had American workers' wages flat for decades in this country until the last couple of years. Those are the policies of Joe Biden. I mean, Wall Street has basically called the tune on economic policy across Republican and Democrat presidents for decades now. Silicon Valley has called the tune when it comes to news and censorship and technology for decades now. President Trump challenged that. They don't want that. They want to go back to the status quo. Joe Biden is the candidate of the status quo.
Yeah, and Senator, on the presidential side, how do you think he changed the Republican Party forever, and what particular issues, and how, regardless of whether he wins or loses, this is going to be a fight for that legacy? How do you view those battle lines on what has changed?
Well, the president really tried to make the Republican Party a working class party. I mean, a party of normal, everyday voters, those who don't have a job on Wall Street, those who don't want to go start a tech company, maybe those who don't have a four-year college degree, which, by the way, is 70% of Americans. And the president tried to refocus this party on those Americans, on their concerns, on their needs, on their family security, on their jobs. And he was right to do so. And I think we've got a big battle in front of us. Whether the president wins or loses tomorrow, we've got a big battle in front of us, Republicans do, to try and make this party truly the party of working class America. And whether it's trade and our disastrous economic policy overseas, which has cost so many jobs, whether it's the power of the monopolies at home, whether it's the power of Wall Street, those are the issues that President Trump has helped bring into focus. And those are the issues we're going to have to fight on hard in the years to come.
Certainly. Last question here for you, sir. The two main dividing lines I see is both on unions and on the deficit. How are you personally thinking about those two issues, particularly in terms of wages and the working class, many union voters who will vote for Donald Trump in this election and voted for him last time around?
Well, just in terms of union voters, I mean, you're absolutely right. A lot of these Americans who are working class folks who don't have those four-year college degrees, don't work in the gig economy or white-collar jobs, they depended on labor unions to be a voice for them. I mean, they depended on that kind of solidarity. And I think Republicans shouldn't be dismissive of the role that unions have played in terms of giving working people a voice. And it's no accident that a lot of union folks are big supporters of President Trump. And I think Republicans need to learn from that. In terms of the deficit, listen, if you want to get the deficit under control, and if you want to see government, the size of government reduced, you've got to make the nation stronger. You've got to make the nation bigger. And to do that, we've got to think about how we get working class jobs back in this country, how we get manufacturing back in this country, how we get working wages up. That's the way you grow the country. You make the nation strong again. That, I think, is how you tackle those issues.
Certainly. Senator, thank you for your time today. We really appreciate it. Thank you for joining us, sir.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. We'll have more Rising for you after this.